My daughter destroyed evidence for a murder case, and I've never been prouder. My 23-year-old daughter Ivy got arrested for breaking into the police precinct and burning evidence for the Richardson murder trial that was supposed to start the next day. The detective's voice was shaking with rage when he called me at 2 a.m. while I was dead asleep in bed. Your daughter just destroyed 6 months of work and ruined the biggest murder case this city has seen in a decade, and we have her on camera pouring gasoline on evidence boxes in our secure storage room before lighting them on fire. I threw on clothes and raced to the station where I found Ivy handcuffed to a metal bench with burn marks on her hands and ash in her hair, but she was sitting perfectly straight with this look on her face like she'd just won the lottery. The arresting officer was screaming at her about federal charges and 20 years in prison, while other cops stood around looking at her like they wanted to throw her through a wall. Ivy, what the hell were you thinking? I asked, kneeling in front of her while the detective paced behind me, rattling off charges including breaking and entering, destruction of property, obstruction of justice, and arson. She looked at me with those sharp brown eyes she got from her father and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. The evidence was fake and everyone here knows it. The detective stopped pacing and turned toward her slowly. You don't know what you're talking about. You're not a cop. You're just some girl whose husband works here. My husband came home crying last night because he couldn't understand why nothing about this case made sense, Ivy said calmly while the detective's face turned red. The blood on the knife was dripped on after it was already in the evidence bag because the pattern shows it fell straight down, not at an angle like it would during a stabbing. I felt my stomach drop because an innocent man had been sitting in jail for 5 months waiting for tomorrow's trial. The other officers in the room were starting to shift uncomfortably and exchange glances. You destroyed evidence because you think you know better than trained detectives? The detective shouted, slamming his hand on the desk. That evidence was going to convict a killer tomorrow. Ivy shook her head and looked directly at the captain who'd just walked in to see what the commotion was about. Captain, the fingerprint on the knife belongs to someone who can't even hold a knife properly because of nerve damage in that hand from an old injury. The captain's face went pale and he stepped closer to Ivy while the detective started sweating. How could you possibly know that? Because my husband looked up the suspect's medical records tonight when he couldn't sleep, Ivy said. And then she turned back to the detective. But that's not why I burned the evidence. Everyone in the room went silent and I could hear my heart pounding in my chest as Ivy continued in that same eerily calm voice. I burned it because when I broke into this building tonight, I went to your office first and found something interesting. The detective lunged at Ivy, but 2 other officers grabbed him while he screamed that she was lying, that she had no right to be in his office, but Ivy just kept talking. You had the real evidence hidden in your desk showing who actually killed Richardson, and you've been getting paid $50,000 a month to frame the wrong person. You're insane, the detective shouted, struggling against the officers holding him. You just destroyed the only evidence in a murder case. Ivy reached into her pocket with her cuffed hands and pulled out a flash drive. This has photos of everything I found in your desk, including the burner phone with texts about payment for framing an innocent man, plus the real forensics report you tried to hide. The captain grabbed the flash drive while the detective went from red to white and started babbling about how this was illegal, how she'd broken into his office, but other officers were already backing away from him like he had the plague. My husband checked your bank account yesterday and found deposits that matched dates when someone made large cash withdrawals, Ivy continued while the detective's world crumbled around him. You were going to send an innocent man to prison for life tomorrow morning while the real killer walked free. The captain was scrolling through the flash drive on his computer, his face getting paler with each image. These texts mention meeting locations and payment amounts, and there are photos of you with someone exchanging envelopes. You think you've won? The detective snarled at Ivy, finally breaking free and getting right in her face. You destroyed the physical evidence, which means nobody goes to jail now. Ivy smiled, and it was the coldest thing I'd ever seen on my daughter's face. I took photos of everything before I burned it, including the chain of custody forms that you forged, and the original crime scene photos you deleted from the computer, but forgot were backed up. The detective pulled out his service weapon and pointed it directly at Ivy's head, while everyone started screaming and the captain shouted for him to drop it while my daughter sat there completely still, staring him down. You want to know who's been paying him? Ivy said quietly as sirens wailed outside. Check the security footage from the night Richardson died and you'll see Officer Walker's patrol car at the scene 2 hours before the 911 call, and he never logged it. Everyone turned to stare at the officer by the door who'd been silent this whole time, and his face went completely white as he reached for his own weapon while backing toward the exit. The captain's voice cut through the chaos as he screamed for everyone to drop their weapons, while Walker's hand moved toward his holster. I grabbed Ivy's shoulders and yanked her down hard just as Walker pulled his gun free. Officers dove behind desks and filing cabinets while the detective pressed his weapon harder against my daughter's temple. 3 officers rushed Walker from different angles and slammed into him at once. His gun went flying across the floor as they crashed into the wall together. Walker was screaming that he was being set up while officers pinned his arms behind his back. The detective started backing toward the wall with his arm around Ivy's throat now. She stayed completely still like she knew any movement might make him pull the trigger. My heart was beating, so hard I thought it might explode out of my chest. The captain moved slowly toward the detective with his hands raised. More officers poured into the room with their weapons drawn and pointed at the detective. Walker was face down on the floor now with 3 officers on top of him. He kept yelling that Ivy was lying and that he didn't kill anyone. The detective's hand was shaking as he held the gun to my daughter's head. I could see sweat running down his face while he looked for an escape route. The sound of boots thundering up the stairs made everyone freeze. SWAT officers burst through the door with rifles raised and red laser dots appeared on the detective's chest. He looked at all those guns pointed at him, and his whole body started shaking. The gun dropped from his hand and clattered on the floor. Ivy stumbled forward as he released her, and I rushed to catch her in my arms. She was trembling now, and I could feel her heart racing against my chest. She whispered that she was okay, and that everything would work out somehow. The SWAT team moved in and forced the detective to the ground while zip-tying his hands. They dragged Walker to his feet and marched both of them toward holding cells. Other officers started processing the scene and taking photos of everything. They led Ivy to the booking area where they took her fingerprints and mugshot. The charges kept piling up as they typed them into the computer. Breaking and entering, arson, obstruction of justice, destruction of evidence, and more. I pulled out my phone and started calling every lawyer I knew at 3 a.m. Most didn't answer, but my friend from college picked up on the third ring. She gave me the number for Sabine Westbrook and said she was the best defense attorney in the city. I called Sabine immediately and explained what happened as fast as I could. She said she'd be there within an hour and told me not to let them question Ivy about anything. I ran back to tell Ivy not to say another word until her lawyer arrived. They had her in an interrogation room already, but I banged on the door until they opened it. I told them her attorney was on the way, and they couldn't question her without representation. The officers looked annoyed, but they had to follow the rules, so they took her back to holding. Sabine showed up exactly when she said she would, wearing a perfect suit at 4 a.m. She walked in like she owned the place and demanded to see her client immediately. The desk sergeant tried to stall, but Sabine shut him down with legal threats. She told me the case would be complicated but winnable given what Ivy exposed. The corruption angle would help, but Ivy still broke serious laws to expose it. Sabine went into the holding area to meet with Ivy while I waited outside. Through the window, I could see Ivy nodding as Sabine explained her rights and options. The detective was in a cell down the hall screaming about how Ivy destroyed the case. He kept yelling that an innocent man would go free because she burned the evidence. The captain came over and told officers to move him to isolation immediately. He made a call to internal affairs about the gun incident and corruption allegations. The whole station was in chaos with officers gathering in small groups throughout the building. Some looked ashamed while others seemed angry about everything that came out. The ones who probably knew something was wrong couldn't look anyone in the eye. They stood apart from the others and stared at the floor or their phones. I heard one officer tell another that he always thought something was off about that case. Another said he'd noticed weird things but didn't want to rock the boat. The sun was starting to come up when Ivy's husband rushed through the front door. His face was destroyed and his eyes were red from crying. He ran to the holding area and grabbed the bars of Ivy's cell. He kept saying he never thought she'd actually break in when he told her about the problems. He was crying and apologizing while holding her hands through the bars. She told him it wasn't his fault, and that she made her own choice. He said he should have gone to internal affairs himself, instead of just complaining at home. The captain was at his computer making copies of everything on Ivy's flash drive. He burned multiple disks and sealed them in evidence bags with signatures and timestamps. Internal affairs officers arrived and immediately sealed the detective's office with crime scene tape. They started cataloging everything inside and taking photos of every drawer and surface. I felt a tiny spark of hope watching them work so carefully. Maybe the truth would actually matter, and the real killer would face justice. The desk sergeant came over and told me the bail hearing was scheduled for 9 that morning. The judge would review the charges and set bail based on flight risk and severity. My stomach churned thinking about the possible sentences Ivy could face. 20 years for arson alone plus everything else could mean life in prison. All for doing the right thing and stopping a corrupt cop from framing an innocent man. Sabine pulled me aside near the vending machines and explained that Ivy was looking at 20 years in prison for the arson charge alone. She said cooperation with the corruption investigation might knock that down, but there were no guarantees with federal charges involved. My legs went weak and I had to grab the wall to stay standing. 20 years meant my daughter would be 43 when she got out. Sabine kept talking about sentencing guidelines and mandatory minimums while I watched Ivy through the glass, still sitting straight in her cell. My phone started buzzing and the screen showed an unknown number calling from a local area code. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Jessica Conrad from the city paper and asked if I had any comment about my daughter's arrest. She said someone inside the department had leaked the whole story, including the corruption allegations. I wanted to tell her everything about the fake evidence and the innocent man in jail, but Sabine had grabbed my phone and ended the call. She told me not to talk to anyone from the press until we had a better handle on the charges. Within an hour, my phone was ringing nonstop with reporters from every news outlet in the state trying to get a statement. I turned it off, but then they started calling my work number and my sister's house looking for me. The story was already online with Ivy's booking photo next to headlines calling her either a hero whistleblower or a dangerous criminal who destroyed evidence. People in the comments were arguing about whether she did the right thing or should rot in jail forever. By noon, there were 3 news vans parked outside my house and reporters knocking on my door every few minutes. I watched from the window as they interviewed my neighbors who all had opinions about Ivy, even though most of them barely knew her. A man in a dark suit arrived at the station and introduced himself as Lieutenant Raoul Shepard from Internal Affairs. He immediately took control of the scene and had officers seal off the evidence room with fresh tape and new locks. He pulled the captain into a conference room and started going through every log and record related to the Richardson case. 2 more Internal Affairs officers showed up with boxes and started collecting everything from the detective's desk and computer. Shepard seemed competent and thorough, which gave me a small bit of hope that someone was taking this seriously. He interviewed every officer who'd worked on the case and made them sign sworn statements about what they knew. The next morning, a prosecutor showed up wearing an expensive suit and carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than my car. Ian Pacheco from the district attorney's office announced he'd been assigned to prosecute Ivy's case personally. He told Sabine he planned to seek maximum charges despite the corruption she'd exposed because destroying evidence was never acceptable. Sabine's face went pale and she pulled me into the hallway to explain that Pacheco had a reputation for being completely rigid about the law. He'd sent a mother to prison for 5 years for stealing formula for her baby, because theft was theft in his book. My small hope crashed into nothing, as I realized Ivy might actually spend decades in prison for doing the right thing. The bail hearing happened that afternoon in a packed courtroom full of reporters and curious citizens. The judge listened to both sides argue about flight risk and danger to the community, before setting bail at $200,000. That meant we needed $20,000 for a bondsman to get her out while we waited for trial. I emptied my savings account, which had $8,000 I'd been saving for a new roof. My sister wired me $5,000 even though she could barely afford it with 3 kids in college. I sold my mother's wedding ring to a pawn shop for $2,000 and borrowed the rest from my retirement account. The bondsman counted the money twice before agreeing to post bail, but warned me that if Ivy missed even one court date, we'd lose everything. They processed her release papers while I waited in the lobby watching other families go through the same horrible process. Ivy finally walked out still wearing the same clothes from the night before with bandages on her burned hands. She hugged me tight and I could feel her shaking even though she was trying to stay strong. In the car, she told me she'd noticed the blood patterns were wrong weeks ago, when her husband showed her crime scene photos at home. She'd spent every night after he went to bed researching blood spatter analysis online and in library books. She'd learned about cast-off patterns and impact angles and how blood behaves differently on different surfaces. She knew with absolute certainty that the blood on the knife had been planted after the fact. She'd tried to convince her husband to report it, but he was scared of losing his job and their health insurance. She'd finally decided she had to act when she realized the trial was starting, and an innocent man would go to prison forever. Lieutenant Shepard got warrants for the detective's bank records and all his electronic devices within 2 days. Sabine heard from a source that they'd found multiple bank accounts and a safety deposit box nobody knew about. The investigation was moving faster than usual, probably because every news outlet in the state was covering the story. Jessica Conrad published her first article about the case, focusing on the chain of custody problems in the Richardson evidence. She didn't take sides but laid out a timeline showing how evidence had been logged and relogged multiple times with different officers' signatures. The article made the police department look either incompetent or corrupt, and probably both. That evening, Ivy's husband came to our house and admitted to Sabine that he'd accessed the suspect's medical records without authorization. He'd used his access to the department computer system to look up information he shouldn't have seen. Now he might face criminal charges too for violating privacy laws and misusing government databases. I felt sick watching him cry at my kitchen table while Ivy held his hand and told him it would be okay. The next morning, I drove to the courthouse alone because Sabine wanted to meet with the prosecutor first. I parked in the garage and walked through the metal detectors where officers stared at me with cold eyes. A big man in a suit stepped in front of me near the elevators and blocked my path completely. He introduced himself as a union rep and said families who turn against cops don't do well in this city. His breath smelled like coffee and cigarettes as he leaned close to my face. I pulled out my phone and started recording while he kept talking about accidents that happen to people. He said cops protect their own and people who forget that learn hard lessons real fast. My hands shook, but I kept the phone steady as he described what happens to snitches. He grabbed my wrist hard enough to leave marks and told me to think about my family. I yanked my arm away and walked past him while he called me names I won't repeat. Lieutenant Shepard was already in the captain's office when I got upstairs to find Sabine. Through the glass door, I could see the captain sweating while Shepard took notes on a tablet. The captain kept wiping his forehead and pointing at files spread across his desk. Shepard showed him something on his tablet that made the captain's face go white. They talked for another hour while I sat in the hallway checking my phone every few minutes. Sabine finally arrived and told me the arraignment was starting in 20 minutes downstairs. The courtroom was packed with reporters holding notebooks and cops in regular clothes filling the back rows. Ian Pacheco stood at the prosecutor's table arranging papers while looking serious and focused. They brought Ivy in through a side door wearing an orange jumpsuit with her hands cuffed in front. She stood straight with her shoulders back while the judge read through the paperwork. Pacheco listed the charges in a loud, clear voice that echoed through the courtroom: breaking and entering, arson, destruction of evidence, obstruction of justice, and tampering with physical evidence. Each charge carried years in prison, and Pacheco made sure everyone knew the maximum sentences. Ivy said not guilty in a strong voice when the judge asked for her plea. The judge set a preliminary hearing date and denied Sabine's request for reduced bail. After they took Ivy back to jail, Sabine pulled me into a conference room down the hall. She said Pacheco might offer a cooperation deal if Ivy testified about everything she found. The idea of my daughter testifying against dirty cops made my stomach hurt. These were people with guns and friends who would do anything to protect each other. Sabine said it might be the only way to keep Ivy out of prison for decades. That afternoon, Shepard called Sabine with news about the investigation moving forward. They'd found Walker on traffic cameras near the warehouse mentioned in the detective's texts. The timestamp showed him there 2 hours before a large cash withdrawal from a nearby ATM. More evidence was piling up, but Ivy's case was moving faster than the corruption investigation. 2 days later, they moved Ivy to protective custody after she got jumped in the shower. 3 women whose cases the detective had worked attacked her with makeshift weapons. She had bruises on her ribs and a cut above her eye that needed stitches. The guards said they couldn't guarantee her safety in general population anymore. Protective custody meant 23 hours alone in a cell with 1 hour for exercise. I visited her through thick glass and she looked tired, but said she was okay. Her husband got the official letter that same day placing him on administrative leave. The department suspended him without pay pending an investigation into his role in accessing records. Now we had no income coming in and mounting legal bills that grew every day. I sold my car and took the bus to work while trying to figure out how to pay everything. The evidence clerk came forward the next week after Shepard guaranteed him immunity. He admitted the detective forced him to create fake chain of custody forms for multiple cases. The detective threatened his job and his family if he didn't cooperate with the scheme. He'd been doing it for 2 years and hated himself for going along with it. My anger at this whole rotten system finally pushed past my fear for Ivy's safety. How many innocent people were in prison because of these fake forms and planted evidence? Pacheco called Sabine with a plea offer that would let Ivy avoid serious prison time. She'd plead to felony tampering and get 5 years probation if she revealed everything. The catch was she had to explain exactly how she got the information and who helped her. She'd still be a convicted felon but might avoid spending years behind bars. Sabine brought the offer to Ivy, who read through it carefully at the jail. Ivy shook her head and said she acted alone when she broke into the station. She refused to give details about her husband's involvement in gathering information beforehand. She told Sabine to negotiate protection for him as part of any deal going forward. Without that protection, she wouldn't cooperate with anything the prosecutor wanted from her. Jessica Conrad called me 3 days later with news that made my hands shake. She'd gotten hold of the detective's burner phone records from someone inside the department who was sick of the corruption. The records showed huge cash deposits right after each text about meeting locations. She published everything online that afternoon, and within hours the story went viral with thousands of people demanding answers. The police department's phones rang nonstop, and protesters gathered outside the station with signs calling for justice. Internal Affairs moved fast after that, and got warrants for the detective's bank records at every bank in town. They found a safe deposit box at First National that nobody knew about. The whole city held its breath waiting to see what was inside that box. When they finally opened it 2 days later, they found $50,000 in cash bundled with rubber bands. There were also 12 different SIM cards in plastic bags with dates written on them. The worst part was a notebook with initials and dates that matched up with cases from the past 3 years. Walker's initials were right there next to the Richardson murder date, along with the amount $20,000. I left the courthouse after hearing this news and noticed a dark sedan staying 3 cars behind me the whole way home. The car had tinted windows and no front license plate, which made me nervous. I pulled into a gas station and watched the sedan drive past slowly before circling back. My hands fumbled with my phone as I took pictures of the car and the back license plate. I sent everything to Sabine right away, and she called me back within minutes telling me to drive straight to the police station. She filed for a protective order that same day and contacted Internal Affairs about the car following me. Meanwhile, she also filed papers asking the judge to lower Ivy's bail because of the threats and her help with the corruption case. She argued that Ivy had exposed crimes way worse than what she'd done herself. The motion laid out how Ivy risked everything to stop an innocent man from going to prison for life. Ian Pacheco fought back hard against the bail reduction and filed his own papers the next morning. He said it didn't matter why Ivy burned the evidence because she still destroyed stuff that couldn't be replaced. His response was 20 pages of legal arguments about how the law is the law no matter what. Reading his rigid stance made me want to grab him by the shoulders and ask if putting innocent people in jail was his idea of justice. That same week, Officer Walker called in sick, and then just disappeared for a whole day. Nobody could find him, and everyone started worrying he might run before they could arrest him. Internal Affairs put out alerts at every airport and bus station within 500 miles. They checked his credit cards and found he'd taken out $3,000 in cash the night before. His patrol car sat in his driveway, but his personal truck was gone. The whole department went into panic mode trying to track him down before he got too far. Ivy called me from jail that night and told me exactly how she'd broken into the station. She'd been watching her husband reset the evidence room alarm for weeks and memorized the code. She climbed through an air vent in the women's bathroom after the night shift change when fewer people were around. The vent led right over the evidence room and she unscrewed the grate from inside. She disabled the alarm using the code and then found the Richardson evidence boxes stacked in the corner. After taking pictures of everything, she poured gasoline from a container she'd brought in a backpack. She said she threw up in the parking lot afterward from nerves, but would do it all again to save that innocent man. 2 days later, Lieutenant Shepard came to interview Ivy with Sabine sitting right beside her. Ivy stuck to the facts without adding extra details or trying to make herself look better. She explained finding the burner phone in the detective's desk drawer under some folders. She described the texts about payment and the photos of the detective meeting someone in a parking garage. She showed Shepard where to find the backup files on the precinct computer that the detective thought he'd deleted. She gave him passwords and file names and explained how the blood evidence had been tampered with. Shepard took notes for 3 hours while Ivy answered every question calmly and clearly. She never tried to justify what she did or paint herself as some kind of hero. The legal bills kept piling up and I ran out of money fast with no income coming in. I went to 3 different pawn shops with my mother's jewelry collection that I'd kept in a safety deposit box for 20 years. The diamond earrings she wore to my wedding got me $800. Her pearl necklace from my father brought in another $600. The worst was her engagement ring, which had been in our family for 3 generations. The pawn shop owner could see me crying as I handed it over, but business is business, and he gave me $2,000. I walked out of that shop feeling like I'd betrayed my mother's memory, but I had to keep fighting for Ivy. Sabine needed another payment, and the bills from the bail bondsman were due. 3 days later, the city council called an emergency meeting about the police corruption scandal, and the room was so packed that people were standing in the hallways and spilling out onto the sidewalk. I squeezed through the crowd to find a seat near the back, while angry voices shouted questions about how many other cases might have fake evidence. The council members sat behind their long desk, looking uncomfortable as citizen after citizen stood up demanding investigations into every case the detective had touched in the past 10 years. A woman whose son was in prison started crying about how the detective had handled his case, and now she didn't know if the evidence was real. The council voted to create an oversight committee, but people kept yelling that wasn't enough, and someone threw a water bottle at the podium. Security guards moved in to calm things down, while the mayor promised full transparency, but nobody believed him. The next morning, the police union held their own press conference on the courthouse steps, with dozens of officers in uniform standing behind their president. He called Ivy a dangerous criminal who destroyed evidence to help her husband avoid getting caught for something, though he never said what that something was. Reporters kept asking about the corruption evidence, but the union president just kept repeating that Ivy was an arsonist who belonged in prison. He claimed she'd put every criminal case in the city at risk by teaching others they could just burn evidence they didn't like. The officers behind him nodded along, but I noticed several weren't making eye contact with the cameras. That afternoon, Sabine released her own statement to the press from her office, while Ivy sat beside her in a business suit we'd bought at a thrift store. Sabine explained that Ivy would testify truthfully about everything she found and would accept appropriate consequences for breaking the law. She emphasized that exposing corruption didn't excuse the arson, but context mattered when determining punishment. Ivy didn't say anything but sat there with her hands folded while cameras clicked and reporters shouted questions. Sabine kept the statement short and didn't take questions, leading Ivy out through a back door to avoid the crowd. 2 weeks passed before the grand jury finally convened to review the corruption evidence while Shepard presented everything Internal Affairs had found. I sat in the hallway for 8 hours waiting to hear if they'd indict the detective on criminal charges. Other witnesses came and went, including several officers who looked sick to their stomachs when they left the jury room. The evidence clerk spent 3 hours inside and came out shaking, so bad he could barely walk. Nobody would tell me what was happening, but I could see from their faces that bad things were being revealed. That night, Ivy's husband came to my apartment after his shift and sat at my kitchen table with his head in his hands. He told me the whole department had a culture of taking shortcuts to close cases fast, because the brass cared more about statistics than truth. Officers who questioned evidence or refused to go along got bad assignments or pushed out completely. He said at least a dozen cops suspected problems with the Richardson case, but nobody wanted to risk their career by speaking up. He started crying when he talked about how he should have done something sooner instead of just complaining to Ivy. The next day, Jessica published a front-page article with security camera images showing Walker's patrol car at the Richardson murder scene at 10:47 p.m., 2 full hours before the 911 call came in at 12:52 a.m. She'd gotten the footage from a nearby business that nobody had thought to check, because the official timeline said the murder happened after midnight. The images were grainy, but the car number was clear, and Walker was visible getting out and walking toward the building. My phone started ringing with death threats within an hour of the article going online, and I had to change my number. Someone spray-painted snitch on my car and slashed all 4 tires while it was parked outside my building. Then Walker showed up at the courthouse with a lawyer claiming he had information to trade for immunity from prosecution. His attorney filed papers saying Walker would testify about the detective's corruption network that involved multiple officers and several major cases. The prosecutor's office went into emergency meetings while reporters camped outside, waiting for any news about what Walker might reveal. I watched from across the street as Walker went in for his immunity hearing, looking pale and sweating through his uniform. 3 hours later, Walker admitted to a room full of investigators that he'd gone to the Richardson scene early to plant the knife on the detective's orders. He claimed he didn't know anyone was going to die and thought they were just setting up a drug dealer for a bigger bust. His story had obvious holes, like why he'd need to plant evidence before a murder that hadn't happened yet, but he gave them names and dates and details about the payment system. He showed them text messages and recorded phone calls that proved the detective had been running this scheme for years. Walker insisted he never killed anyone and was just following orders because the detective threatened to destroy his career if he didn't cooperate. That same afternoon, Pacheco announced he would prosecute Ivy separately from the corruption case and wouldn't offer any blanket immunity deal. He stood at a podium looking stern while explaining that destroying evidence was a serious crime regardless of the motivation behind it. My heart sank into my stomach as he listed the charges Ivy still faced and the potential prison time for each one. He said the corruption investigation and Ivy's prosecution were 2 different matters that shouldn't be confused. Sabine immediately shifted strategy and filed for deferred adjudication, where Ivy would plead to lesser charges and complete probation plus community service instead of going to prison. She argued that Ivy's actions, while illegal, had exposed massive corruption and saved an innocent man from life in prison, which should count for something. The deal would mean Ivy avoiding jail, but having a criminal record unless she completed everything perfectly, and even then she'd need to petition to get it expunged. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than Ivy spending years behind bars for doing what she believed was right. Sabine had Ivy sit down at her office table the next morning with a yellow legal pad and told her to write everything down about why she burned those evidence boxes. Ivy wrote for 2 hours straight without stopping while I sat in the corner watching her hand move across the paper. She wrote about seeing her husband come home shaking after looking at crime scene photos that made no sense, and how she couldn't let an innocent man go to prison when she knew the truth. She didn't write that she was some kind of hero or that the system forced her hand, just that she made a choice and would accept whatever came from it. Sabine read through it 3 times before nodding and saying she'd submit it to the court. 2 days later, the grand jury met in a closed session while we waited outside the courthouse with reporters everywhere asking questions we couldn't answer. They took 4 hours reviewing everything Internal Affairs had found in the detective's office and bank records before voting to indict him on 12 counts, including bribery and evidence tampering. The bailiff came out and announced the indictment while Sabine squeezed my hand so hard I thought she might break it. That night, I watched on the news as 6 police cars pulled up to the detective's house, and officers walked him out in handcuffs while his neighbors stood on their lawns recording with their phones. He tried to cover his face, but the cameras caught everything, including him stumbling on his front steps because his hands were cuffed behind his back. I sat on my couch eating cold pizza and feeling something close to satisfaction for the first time since this whole mess started. Walker got suspended without pay the next morning, and his lawyer brought boxes of printed text messages to Internal Affairs, showing every payment and instruction from the detective going back 2 years. The messages showed dates and amounts and drop locations where Walker would pick up cash in exchange for planting evidence or losing reports. Lieutenant Shepard spent 3 days going through everything while Walker sat in a conference room pointing out which cases had been fixed and which suspects had been framed. The detective's whole operation fell apart piece by piece as Walker gave them names of other cops who knew, but stayed quiet, and criminals who'd paid to make charges disappear. Pacheco called Sabine's office on Thursday to say he was filing formal charges against Ivy for arson and tampering with evidence, but would consider a plea deal if she cooperated fully. The reality hit me like a punch to the stomach that my daughter would still have a criminal record, even though she'd exposed massive corruption. Sabine spent the next week going back and forth with Pacheco's office trying to get the best deal possible while Ivy sat at home unable to work or leave the state. They finally agreed on 3,000 hours of community service spread over 5 years, plus monthly restitution payments and supervised probation, with the chance to get everything expunged if she completed it all perfectly. The deal meant Ivy wouldn't go to prison, but her life would be controlled by the court system for the next 5 years, with any mistake sending her straight to jail. We all sat around my kitchen table that Saturday night for the first time in weeks eating Chinese takeout and not really talking about anything important. Ivy's husband kept reaching over to touch her hand like he needed to make sure she was really there, while my sister asked careful questions about the legal process. Nobody wanted to say out loud how scared we all were, or how much this had cost us already with more bills coming. Ivy looked tired in a way that went deeper than just needing sleep, like something inside her had shifted permanently. The judge reviewed the plea agreement the following Tuesday in a packed courtroom, while Ivy stood next to Sabine in the same black dress she'd worn to her wedding. He added 1,000 hours to the community service requirement and monthly check-ins with a probation officer, plus mandatory cooperation with any investigation related to the corruption case. Ivy said she understood and accepted the terms without any hesitation, even though I could see her hands shaking as she signed the papers. The judge made it clear that any violation would result in immediate incarceration for the full sentence with no possibility of early release. After court, Ivy signed more papers agreeing to testify whenever prosecutors needed her for any case connected to the detective's corruption network. She'd have to relive this whole thing over and over in different courtrooms for different trials, but she told Sabine she was ready to tell the truth as many times as necessary. The captain held a press conference that afternoon announcing new evidence handling protocols including random audits and mandatory oversight for any case involving more than $50,000 in seized assets. He stood at the podium looking older than I'd ever seen him, talking about rebuilding trust and learning from failures, while reporters shouted questions about how deep the corruption went. Small changes that might prevent another detective from destroying innocent lives, but wouldn't undo the damage already done. Ivy's husband got called into his supervisor's office the next morning, where they gave him a written reprimand for accessing records without authorization and told him he'd have to complete 40 hours of additional training on proper procedures. He came home that night looking relieved because he'd been sure they would fire him or worse, but the department needed officers who actually cared about doing the right thing. We could keep paying bills and Ivy could make her restitution payments without losing the house, which felt like the first good news we'd gotten in weeks. Jessica Conrad called me 3 days later asking for a comment on her follow-up article about Ivy's guilty plea and the corruption scandal. I told her we had nothing to say, but she published the piece anyway with a headline calling Ivy both criminal and hero in the same sentence. The article went viral with people arguing in the comments about whether burning evidence was ever justified even when exposing corruption. I started picking up extra shifts at the warehouse loading trucks, until my back hurt so bad I could barely stand, but we needed every dollar for the restitution payments. Ivy began her 1,000 hours of community service at a legal aid clinic downtown, where they had her filing papers and answering phones for people who couldn't afford lawyers. She came home that first week with dark circles under her eyes, but said she actually liked helping people understand court documents they couldn't read on their own. We sat at the kitchen table with bills spread everywhere, working out a payment plan that would take 5 years to complete if nothing went wrong. The clinic supervisor called me after Ivy's second week saying she was doing great work and had already helped 3 families fill out forms for housing assistance. I watched Ivy throw herself into the work like she was trying to make up for everything by helping as many people as possible. One night I heard crying from her room and found her sitting on the floor shaking with her knees pulled to her chest. She told me she kept dreaming about the fire getting out of control and burning down the whole building with people trapped inside. I held her while she sobbed about how she could have killed someone if the fire had spread to other rooms. We sat there on her bedroom floor until the sun came up, and she finally stopped shaking enough to eat some toast. The detective's lawyer called Sabine that afternoon saying his client would take a plea deal forfeiting his pension and testifying against other corrupt officers. He'd serve 5 years minimum in federal prison, which seemed like nothing compared to what he'd done, but at least he wouldn't walk free. Walker's testimony to the grand jury detailed how supervisors were ignored obvious signs of evidence tampering because they wanted high conviction rates. The department announced new oversight protocols and external audits, but everyone knew real change would take years if it happened at all. Ivy threw herself even harder into her community service work and started staying late to help people prepare for court hearings. The clinic supervisor told me Ivy had a gift for explaining complicated legal terms in ways regular people could understand. 3 months passed with Ivy working 60 hours a week between her regular job and community service while I worked doubles to keep up with bills. The detective got transferred to federal prison in another state after threats from other inmates whose cases he'd worked. Walker got 18 months in minimum security and would probably be out in less than a year with good behavior. More officers got suspended as internal affairs kept digging through old cases, but most would keep their jobs with just written warnings. 6 months after that terrible night at the police station, our whole family gathered for Sunday dinner at my sister's house. Ivy's husband had gotten promoted despite everything, and they were slowly rebuilding their marriage day by day. We ate pot roast and talked about normal things like the weather and TV shows instead of court dates and legal bills. Everyone looked older and more tired, but we were together, and that meant everything after what we'd been through. I drove Ivy to the legal aid clinic the next morning and watched through the window as she helped an elderly woman understand her eviction notice. She sat patiently explaining each paragraph and writing down phone numbers for emergency housing assistance while the woman cried with relief. My daughter had burned evidence and destroyed her clean record, but she was using that experience to help people navigate a system that would have crushed them. Our future was harder now with years of payments ahead, and Ivy carrying a criminal record that would follow her forever. But watching her help that woman reminded me why I was proud of her for doing what she believed was right, even knowing the cost. The ashes of what she burned had exposed the truth and saved an innocent man from life in prison. We were building something better from those ashes, one small act of help at a time, even if it took the rest of our lives to balance the scales. Thanks for sticking with me through all this. It's definitely been a ride sharing these moments together. I'll see you around next time. Like the video, it helps more than you think.